I've been a vet for 34 years. I've put my hands on things that could kill me without noticing. 600-kilo bulldray lizards out of the Sore Basin, ridgeback sand serpents that could take a man's arm at the shoulder, the occasional way station camel that had decided, with great conviction, that I was the source of every grievance it had ever suffered. You learn early in this work that the most dangerous animal in any room is the one that has been hurt too many times, and no longer believes that another living thing can be trusted. You don't fix that with a needle. You don't fix it with a drug. You fix it, if you fix it at all, by being present in a way that costs you nothing and asks nothing back, until the animal decides, on its own timetable, that your presence is not another kind of harm. That is the whole of what I did for Keth-dorath. I want to be clear about that before I say anything else, because the way this story has been told since, and it has been told, I'm afraid, whether I wished it or not, tends to involve words like gift and courage and singular compassion, and I don't think any of those words are accurate. What I had was time. What I had was a sandwich and a thermos of tea and a 3-day window in which no one else needed me. What Keth-dorath had was 11 years of silence and a room in the back of a crumbling way station temple that smelled of old stone and dried herbs and the faintly metallic undertone that very old, scaled creatures carry when they've been still for too long. What I did was sit down in that room and eat my lunch. The rest, as they say, followed. The assignment came through my regional coordinator, a woman named Pol Vasson, who ran the Frontier Veterinary Dispatch out of the keth-dorath transit node about 40 kilometers east of where I kept my practice. Pol was competent, direct, and largely immune to what she called the softer registers of persuasion, which was her way of saying that she did not respond well to being argued with. I had a functional working relationship with Pol, which meant I knew when to ask questions and when not to. She called me on a Tuesday morning in the dry season, when the dust off the Velschen Plateau was bad enough that I'd been keeping the clinic shutters half closed to spare the instruments. I had a pen in one hand and a set of vaccination records spread across the desk, and I picked up the line expecting it to be the Darosi family about their breeding stock. "It was Pol," she said. "I need you at Soreth Way Station, Temple Annex, East Wing. What am I looking at?" A pause. Pol did not often pause. An ancient. "Put the pen down. How old?" "Registry says Keth-dorath of the keth-dorath line. Logged age is 417 standard years." I let that sit for a moment. In the normal run of my work, I dealt with creatures whose lifespans ran to 30, 40, 80 years at the outer limit. I'd seen one dragon before in my career, a juvenile, grounded by a broken radius at the core of the way station freight depot, young enough to be confused and frightened rather than dangerous, and even then the scale of it had been enough to make the back of my neck go cold in a way I remembered for weeks. An ancient of 417 years was something else entirely. "What's the complaint?" Another pause. Longer this time. "The temple keepers have had her in the annex for 11 years. She was brought there after the Keth-dorath fleet withdrew from this sector. The line, historian says, she was the matriarch companion of the second formation, whatever that means, and she was injured during the withdrawal. Not the wings, not the limbs, they don't know exactly. She stopped responding to contact about 9 years ago. Stopped eating with any consistency about 6 years ago. The keepers have been supplementing her nutrition through a feeding line, but her body condition has declined considerably, and 3 weeks ago she stopped accepting the line." I waited. "Regional has classified her as non-responsive and palliative," Pol said. "The current order is to monitor and report. If she deteriorates further, if she appears to be in active distress, the order moves to euthanasia by authorized protocol." Who authorized that? The Keth-dorath line's last recognized regional contact authorized it 8 years ago. 8 years ago, I repeated. That contact has not been active since. There is no current Keth-dorath representative for this sector. I looked at the shutters, at the line of pale light coming through the gap, at the dust moving slowly in it. 3 days, Pol said. That's the monitoring window before the order reviews. I need someone there, documented on site. The temple keepers are not veterinary staff. They've done what they can. I'll go, I said. Pol exhaled, a small sound, but it was the closest thing to relief I had ever heard from her. I'll send the file to your reader. She ended the call. I sat at my desk for a few minutes longer, not reading the vaccination records. Soreth Way Station was 2 hours by ground car, heading west along the Plateau Road, until the land dropped down toward the Velschen Basin and the old way station settlement came into view, a cluster of low buildings, a freight depot, a water reclamation tower, and at the far end of the settlement, set slightly apart from the commercial structures, the temple. It had been a functioning temple of the Corval Order once, according to the briefing file Pol sent, Before the order had consolidated its operations further east and left behind a skeleton keeping staff of 3. Now it was a waystation spiritual facility, in the minimal sense. The keepers maintained the building, conducted the ceremonial observances that the regional transit charter required, and for 11 years had cared for the creature in the East Wing Annex. I arrived in the early afternoon. The senior keeper, a man named Arvith Dawn, met me in the entrance courtyard. He was in his 60s, lean, with the weathered patience of someone who had spent decades in a building with very little foot traffic and a great deal of time to think. He shook my hand with both of his. That struck me. "Vetkale," he said, "thank you for coming." "Tell me about her," I said. We walked while he talked. The temple was cool stone, the floors smooth with age, the light coming in through narrow high windows and long pale bars. Arvith Dawn had been one of the original 3 keepers assigned when Keth-dorath was brought in. He had been the one who handled the feeding line for the past 6 years. He had been the one who noticed 3 weeks ago that she was refusing it. "She doesn't make sound," he said. "She hasn't, not in 9 years. Not since she stopped responding to the ceremonial greetings." We continued those. The greetings, the offerings, the formal addresses, because the charter requires it, and because it seemed wrong to stop even if she gave us nothing back. But there's been no response, no movement toward us. Sometimes I wasn't certain she knew we were there at all. We went down a side corridor, east, the air getting slightly cooler and carrying that metallic undertone I had read about in the briefing file, and was now smelling for the first time in reality. It was not an unpleasant smell. Old, certainly, mineral and deep, like the inside of a stone cistern that had been dry for many years. Complex in the way that very old living things are complex, layered in a way you couldn't fully account for. Arvith Dawn stopped at a door, a large one, reinforced old iron hinges, and put his hand on the latch. "Vetkale," he said quietly, "I want you to know that that is, my 2 colleagues and I, we have tried. We have not been indifferent. We have kept the prayers and the offerings, and we have spoken to her every day for 11 years. I want that understood." "I understand it," I said, "and I have no doubt of it." He opened the door. The annex was large. That was the first thing, the scale of the space. The old temple keepers had known what they were building when they constructed this wing, or whoever had built it had known, which meant it predated the current order by a considerable margin. The ceiling was high enough to accommodate a creature 3 times Keth-dorath's size. There were columns of pale stone at intervals and high windows on the south wall, and on the floor a great deal of dried bedding material, reed and straw and what looked like pressed cordgrass that the keepers had been renewing at intervals. The bedding occupied the center left of the room. In it, Keth-dorath lay, she enormous. That is not a sufficient word, and I am aware of its insufficiency, but it is the honest one. She was enormous in the way that geographical features are enormous, in the way that a cliff face or a river in flood is enormous. Not as an abstraction, but as a felt fact, a thing the body understands before the mind can organize it. Scaled in deep green black, the scales themselves enormous, each one larger than my hand, ridged and layered and weathered in the way of something very, very old. Her wings were folded against her body, the great joint bones visible as ridges under the wing membrane, which was darkened and thickened with age but intact. Her tail was coiled loosely behind her, her neck was long and carried her head low, too low. Resting on the edge of the bedding, the chin almost to the floor, her eyes were open. That was the second thing I registered. Her eyes were open. They were large, the diameter of a dinner plate, set under a great brow ridge, arised in what had once, I thought, been a vivid amber gold, now gone pale and milky, the color of old candle wax, cataracts, dense ones, bilateral. She had been blind or nearly blind. For some time, whether from age or injury or both, I could not have said at that moment without examination. She did not react to my entry. She did not react to Arvith Dawn's presence beside me. The pale eyes were open and oriented toward the south windows, toward the light, in the unfocused way of an animal that cannot see the light clearly, but can still perceive some difference between where it was and where it wasn't. I stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at her, and she did not know I was there, or if she knew, it meant nothing to her. "I'll need a chair," I said. Arvith Dawn blinked. A chair, and I'll want to know what she's been eating, or was eating, before the refusal, and whether she responds at all to sound. Not the formal greetings, informal sound, conversation, low tones. He nodded slowly, processing. "I'll bring you a chair." Her last reliable intake was the grain and marrow supplement through the line, grade 4 concentrate, the large body formula. She ate dried cordgrass voluntarily in the early years. Stopped that about 4 years ago. Sound. He hesitated. "I've spoken to her. Every day. I don't know if she hears it. I've never seen a response to voice." "All right," I said. "The chair, when you have a moment." He went. I stayed in the doorway a little longer, not yet moving into the room. My kit bag was over my shoulder. I was not going to open it yet. I was not going to approach yet, not because I was afraid. I was cautious. But it was the professional caution that comes from experience, not the cold neck fear from the juvenile at Corveth all those years ago. I was not going to approach yet because there was no reason to approach yet, and because the first and most important thing I could do for this animal right now was simply be in the room without demanding anything. I walked in. I found a spot along the wall about 4 meters from the edge of her bedding in the long bar of light from the southernmost window. I set my kit bag down. I sat on the floor against the wall, drew my knees up, and looked at her. She did not respond. The pale eyes stayed on the window. Her breathing was slow. I could see the enormous rib cage moving, the scales shifting against each other with a faint dry sound at intervals. The breathing was slow, but it was regular, and that was something. I sat there for about 20 minutes, not speaking, not moving, just being present in the room. When Arvith Don came back with the chair, I thanked him and told him he could go. He looked at me over the back of the chair with an expression I couldn't entirely read. Part worry, part something else. And then he nodded and left, pulling the door to behind him, not quite closed. I left the chair against the wall and stayed on the floor. It was more comfortable, and I thought it probably made me look less upright, less official, less like something that was there to make a decision about her. I opened my thermos of tea and poured a cup. The first day, I did not examine her. I did not approach the edge of her bedding. I sat in the bar of light against the wall, and I ate my lunch, the sandwich I'd brought, a rather pedestrian combination of cured meat and sharp cheese on journey bread that my housekeeper, Mart, pressed on me every time I went out to a long call, as if the act of giving me food was a form of protection against whatever the frontier might contain. And I drank my tea and I talked, not to her exactly, or not pointedly to her. I talked the way you talk in a room where there might be someone listening and might not be, in the way I sometimes talk to recovering animals in the back of my van, not expecting a response but not ruling one out either. I talked about the drive out, about the dust on the plateau road, about the pair of Ridge deer I'd seen on the embankment near the way station, turn about the fact that one of them had a suspect hind leg, probably an old strain, probably managing fine. I talked about Moret and the sandwich. I talked about the practice and its regulars, the Ossie family's breeding stock, the Dracar freight lizards that came through twice a year for their hoof work, the semi-feral camelid out at the Dornflats farm that had been semi-feral for so long that it had become a fixed feature of my professional landscape, like the weather. Velderith did not respond. The pale eyes stayed on the window. I stayed until late afternoon. I left when the light through the south windows began to go horizontal, and the room grew a little cooler. I told Arvith Don, on my way out, that I would be back in the morning. He looked at me with that same expression from before. "What are you doing?" he asked. Not unkindly, genuinely. "Being there," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "For 11 years I know," I said, and it mattered. "Don't think it didn't." I picked up my kit bag. "I'm not doing anything different from what you've been doing. I'm just doing it in the room." He let me out through the courtyard. The evening was warm, the sky the flat pale blue of late dry season, and I drove back to my practice along the plateau road and thought about what I'd seen. She was starving slowly. That was the clinical fact. 417 years old, blind, whatever injury had been done to her during the fleet withdrawal, either unresolvable or unresolved. She had, at some point in the last 9 years, decided to be unavailable. Not to die exactly, she was not dying with any urgency, but to be elsewhere internally in a way that physical care alone could not address. The feeding line had kept her body present. It had not kept her attention. What I kept thinking about was the way her eyes had been oriented toward the window, toward the light. There was still something in her that preferred the light to the dark, that turned toward it by reflex even if it couldn't see it clearly. That seemed worth knowing. The second day I brought a different sandwich. Marit had packed it the same way, same bread, but I'd asked her for the dried core fruit paste instead of the cured meat, partly because I thought something with a stronger smell might be more interesting, partly because I like core fruit paste and it seemed like a reasonable occasion to have it. I arrived in the morning, when the light through the south windows was still white and direct, and I came into the room and sat down in my spot against the wall without making a production of it, and I said not to Veldorath exactly, but into the room, morning, the way you'd say it walking into any room where someone else already was. I had been there perhaps an hour, working through a set of case notes I'd brought with me on the reader, when I noticed something I had not noticed the day before. Her head was slightly higher, not by much, an increment. The chin that had been almost to the floor was perhaps a hand's width off it. It might have been coincidence. She might have shifted in the night for reasons entirely unrelated to my presence. But I noted it and I did not mention it aloud, because it seemed like the kind of thing that would diminish if you looked at it directly. I opened the core fruit paste sandwich and ate it slowly, and the smell of it, sweet tart, resinous, faintly fermented in the way of dried core fruit, moved through the room the way smells do in stone buildings, in slow, even diffusion. Her nostrils moved. I have seen enough animals in my career to know the difference between the involuntary respiratory motion of a creature that is simply breathing and the deliberate gathering, information-seeking motion of a nostril that is reading the air. These were the latter. A slow opening, a slight flare, a hold. Then again, I kept eating my sandwich. I kept making notes on my reader. I did not turn to look at her directly. After about 10 minutes, she moved her head. Not toward me or not pointedly toward me. She moved it so that the long neck rotated slightly, so that the pale, milky eyes were no longer aimed at the south window, but aimed at roughly in my direction. Aimed at the smell, probably. Aimed at the sound of me chewing and writing. Aimed at the fact of me in the room. I took a sip of tea. Core fruit, I said conversationally, if you were wondering. My housekeeper makes the paste. I've been asking her to make it for 20 years, and she always acts as though it's an unusual request. Nothing further. The head stayed oriented approximately toward me. The breathing continued. I went back to my case notes and let her be. In the afternoon of the second day, I stood up and walked, slowly, no particular purpose in my posture, the gait of someone crossing a room to look at a window, in a wide arc around the edge of her bedding, not toward her, just moving through the space, occupying the space differently. I let myself get to within about 2 meters of the nearmost point of her tail, and then I stopped and looked at the south windows for a few minutes, and then I walked back and sat down again. She tracked me. Not visually, she couldn't, not clearly, but her head followed my movement the way an animal follows sound. The long neck turned by degrees, the pale eyes moving to where I was. I had seen this before in blind animals, horses with late-stage cataracts, elderly working hounds who had lost their sight but not their social orientation, and the behavior was always the same. They could not see you, but they could place you. And placing you was enough, and being placed was a form of contact even when nothing else was exchanged. I sat back down. "Good afternoon," I said. Still me. I made a note in my case file. Patient is responsive to sound. Patient oriented toward auditory stimulus. Patient demonstrated voluntary repositioning. Possible comfort seeking in relation to novel stimulus. Head tracking of human movement confirmed bilateral. Eyes appear to register broad light differential but not detail. Recommend extension of monitoring window. Recommend continuation of low-demand auditory contact rather than formal address. Recommend introduction of previously acceptable food stimuli. Core grass via olfactory presentation. It was a clinical note. It was also, I was aware, a description of sitting on a mat and talking about the weather to a creature that had been alone in a stone room for 11 years. Sometimes the clinical and the simple are exactly the same thing. Then I ate the rest of my lunch and read the rest of my case notes and talked intermittently about nothing in particular, about the Velschen Basin's water level this season, about the new freight regulations at Corvith that had been causing problems for the large-body livestock haulers, about the fact that the ridge-backed serpents in the Dorn corridor seemed to be moving their den range, and I wasn't sure whether that was a seasonal variation or something worth flagging to the Regional Wildlife Authority. I talked about a camelid I'd treated the week before that had presented with a secondary hoof abscess so perfectly hidden that I'd nearly missed it, and about the particular satisfaction of finding the thing you nearly missed and fixing it anyway. I talked about the way the plateau road looked in the early morning before the dust came up, which was the most beautiful it ever looked, pale and flat and empty with the light coming at a flat angle off the stone, she breathed. The scales shifted at intervals. Once, while I was talking about the plateau road, her tail moved. A slow, unconscious uncurling, a small readjustment, the kind of motion an animal makes when it has relaxed a small amount without quite deciding to. I noted that too, on a separate line. When I stood to leave in the late afternoon, Vildora's head followed the sound of my rising, followed it as I picked up my kit bag, followed it as I walked toward the door. I paused in the doorway. "Back tomorrow," I said. She did not respond. But the head was still turned toward the door when I looked back, and the pale eyes, the candle wax eyes, were aimed at the space I had just left with a quality of attention that I did not have a clinical term for, and that I was not going to try to name in a case file. On the morning of the third day, I brought 2 sandwiches, a larger thermos, and a folding mat for the floor, because my back had been registering its opinion of the stone wall for 2 days, and it seemed unreasonable not to accommodate it. I also brought In the outer pocket of my kit bag, a portion of dried cordgrass, the type the briefing file had noted she used to eat voluntarily in the early years. I had stopped at the way station freight depot the previous evening on the way out and found a bale of it in their livestock supplies. Grade agricultural, unprocessed, the real thing. I'd taken enough for the day and left the depot's freight coordinator a note about potential standing order in case it came to that. When I came into the room, she turned her head toward the door before I had fully crossed the threshold. I stopped. The threshold was perhaps 7 meters from the nearest edge of her bedding. She could not have seen me, not at that distance, not through those cataracts, not in any meaningful visual sense. She had heard the door. She had heard my particular weight on the stone floor, my particular way of moving, which is slightly uneven. Old ankle break from a bull dray incident 15 years ago left my left side footfall about 5% heavier than the right, and she had turned her head toward that specific pattern of sound. She had learned it. In 2 days she had learned what I sounded like. I stood still for a moment. "Morning," I said. The head adjusted fractionally toward my voice. I walked to my spot and sat down, and I put the cordgrass on the mat beside me, close enough that the smell of it would move through the room, and I opened my thermos and poured the first cup of the day, and I did not rush anything. The stone room was warm from the south-facing windows. The morning light was still low and direct, coming in nearly horizontal, and it lay across the floor in long, pale bars between the columns. I opened my case notes and began reviewing what I'd written the day before. Good notes are the foundation of good follow-up, and good follow-up is the whole of veterinary medicine when you get far enough down into it. The ability to compare what was with what is and see whether the gap is closing or opening. The gap in this case, over 2 days, had closed in measurable ways. Voluntary orientation to stimulus, voluntary repositioning toward novel input, tail movement indicating relaxation. Those were not large things, individually. Collectively, they were the difference between a patient who had gone somewhere inside herself and had no interest in returning, and a patient who was beginning, very cautiously, to permit the possibility. About 40 minutes later, I heard her move. In 2 days, she had not moved. Not the full body, not the slow, enormous shifting of a 417-year-old creature deciding to change her orientation. The sound of it was extraordinary, a deep, liquid sound, the scales moving against each other and against the dried bedding, a sound like a slow tide on a coarse beach, each individual scale-on-scale contact contributing to a whole that was less a noise than a presence, a fact of the room asserting itself. And with it the movement of air, not wind, nothing so mechanical as that, but the subtle redistribution of the whole atmosphere of the space as something very large rearranged itself, the way the air in a room changes when a door opens into another room, a sense of additional volume becoming available. I looked up from my notes. She had moved her head closer to me. Not her body, the body was still in the beddings, still in its posture of rest, but the neck had extended, slowly, across the floor toward my side of the room, and the great head had come to rest about 2 meters from my mat. The pale eyes were pointed at me, and at the cordgrass beside me, the nostrils moving with that slow, thorough, information-gathering flair. I sat very still. My heart was doing something that I would later describe to Polvasson as a variety of things in quick succession, but outwardly I was still. Experience teaches you that the moment you change your behavior in response to an animal's approach, the moment your body registers the significance of what is happening and tries to respond to that significance, the approach stops. You stay ordinary. You stay the same person you were before the extraordinary thing began, and the extraordinary thing continues. "All right," I said quietly. "All right." I picked up the cordgrass and I held a handful of it out toward her head, my arm extended, palm up, the way you hold a treat out to any animal that hasn't yet decided whether you're trustworthy. Not pushing it toward her, just making it available. The cordgrass was dry and faintly prickly against my palm, and it smelled the way dried grasses smell in stone rooms, ancient and clean and specific, the smell of a thing that had been living once and still remembered it. The nostrils moved, long and slow and thorough. The great head lowered slightly. And then, with the careful deliberateness of something that had not done this for a long time, and was deciding to do it now on its own terms, she opened her mouth and took the cordgrass from my hand. I did not move. I barely breathed. I refilled my palm with cordgrass and held it out again, and again she took it, and the dry, resinous smell of it mixed with the mineral smell of her, and the room was very quiet, and outside the south windows the morning light was coming in almost horizontal across the top of the plateau, flat and white and very clean. I stayed there for 4 hours, feeding her cordgrass by the handful and talking, and by the time the light shifted to midday angle she had shifted her whole body, the whole enormous, ancient, scaled weight of her, 20 degrees toward me, so that she was no longer oriented to the south window, but was oriented toward the wall where I was sitting, and her head was resting on the floor about a meter from my mat, and the pale eyes, the candle wax eyes, were pointed at my face with the quiet attention of a creature that had been somewhere else for a long time, and had possibly come back a little. I ate my sandwiches. I talked about the core-ridge deer with the suspect hind leg, and whether it was worth trying to get close enough to assess it properly. She breathed. The scales shifted. The room was warm and light and quiet. It was Arvith Dawn who came to find me in the late afternoon, and his face when he came through the door was the face of a man seeing something he had stopped expecting to see. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the position of her head, at the orientation of her body, at the pile of core grass on my mat, at the closeness of the great head to where I was sitting. Then he looked at me. "She's been eating," I said. "Voluntary, core grass. I'll need to source more. The depot has enough for another day or two, but you'll want a standing order placed." Arvith Dawn made a sound. It was not a word exactly. It was the sound of a man trying to locate which words applied. "She moved toward you," he said. "This morning. She hasn't moved voluntarily toward a living thing in." He stopped. "I know," I said. He came into the room slowly and stood about 3 meters from the head and looked at the pale eyes and said very quietly, in what I understood was the formal Veldorath greeting, a phrase I didn't know, in the old draconian trade register, which the temple keepers had been saying every day for 11 years, he said it. And Veldorath's head turned toward him, very slowly, and the great nostrils moved. Arvith Dawn pressed both hands over his mouth. I pretended to be very interested in my case notes. After a few minutes, he collected himself. He sat down on the floor about a meter from me, his back against the wall, his hands in his lap. We sat like that for a while. The three of us, the old keeper and the frontier vet and the blind ancient between us, the afternoon light moving slowly across the floor. "What did you do?" he asked eventually. "Nothing," I said. "I was in the room. We were in the room. You were performing in the room. Correctly and well and out of real care. I don't mean that as a criticism. But the greetings, the offerings, the formal addresses, those were things you did to her. Things that required something from her in return, even if only that she register your respect. I just sat here." I looked at the pale eyes. "She didn't need to do anything about me." He was quite quiet for a long time. "You should stay," he said. "I can extend to a 5th day. After that, I have stock to attend to. But we can talk about what kind of ongoing presence she needs, and whether there's a way to structure the care differently going forward." He nodded slowly. We sat in the warm light and the quiet. I put in a formal monitoring extension request through Polvassen the following morning. Pol's response was 4 words, documented, proceeding, good work. That was about as effusive as Pol got, and I appreciated it. I stayed a 5th day and a 6th. On the 4th day, Veldorath accepted water voluntary. From a shallow basin the keepers had kept filled and available for years unused, and which she now moved to on her own and drank from with the slow, focused attention of something recovering a practice it remembered. On the 5th day, she ate from the supplemental concentrate as well as the grass, the feeding line sitting untouched across the room. On the 6th day, she stood. That was something. Even from where I was, sitting against my wall with my notes and my thermos, the standing was something. She unfolded from the bedding over the course of about 20 minutes, the wings shifting against her flanks, the great legs finding their place under her. And she was tall in a way that the room had evidently been built to accommodate, but that I, standing at my full height of perhaps 1.75 m, had not quite fully calibrated for. She stood, and her head was at the height of the high windows, and the afternoon light fell on her back, on the deep green-black scales, and they were not merely green-black. They were, in that light, also amber and deep red and the particular color of the inside of a storm cloud, and I understood, standing at the wall with my notes in my hand, that I had been looking at her in poor light for 5 days and had not fully seen what she was. "There we are," I said, to no one in particular. She turned her head toward my voice. "I need to tell about the 7th morning carefully, because it has been told badly elsewhere, and I am the only one who was there for all of it. I arrived at the usual time, the morning after her standing. Arvith Dawn met me in the courtyard as he always did, but his posture was different, tighter, with the alert stillness of someone managing news. "Something has happened," he said. "Tell me." "Last night." He glanced toward the east wing. Sensors at the regional perimeter recorded inbound signatures, not freight, not transit. The way station recorded formal approach patterns, the kind used for, he paused, searching for the right frame. The kind used for ceremonial contact. I looked at him. "They're here," he said, "in the landing yard, behind the east wall. They arrived before dawn. They haven't entered. They're waiting." "How many?" The sensors counted 9 ships. He looked at me with the careful expression of someone delivering information whose weight he was still calculating. The registry codes, our reader identified them as keth-dorath line, thermos line. I set my kit bag down. I thought about that for a moment. 9 ships. thermos line. Arriving in ceremonial approach pattern before dawn and waiting outside the wall without entering. They didn't announce themselves. They sent one transmission through the temple's formal reception channel about an hour ago. Arvith Don consulted his reader. It says, "We were told she had lifted her head. We asked permission to enter." I stared at him. "Who told them?" He shook his head slowly. "I don't know. We didn't transmit. I don't know how they knew." I was quiet for a moment. Then I picked up my kit bag. "Let's go see her first. She was standing when we came in." Had been standing, I thought, since early morning. The bedding was undisturbed, as if she hadn't used it. She was standing in the center of the room, her head at window height, and she was oriented not toward the south windows but toward the east wall, toward the landing yard on the other side of it, and her nostrils were moving with a slow, steady, purposeful gathering of information. She knew they were there. I came into the room and she turned her head toward me before I had cleared the door, and I said, "Morning," the way I always did, and her nostrils moved the way they always did, and then she turned her head back toward the east wall. I walked to my spot and put down my kit bag and poured my tea, and I watched her. She was not distressed. That was the thing I was reading for, the way you read it in any animal whose known world is about to change. The tight muscle around the jaw, the slight flaring of a nostril, in a way that's different from information gathering, more like bracing, the weight shifting fractionally backward. She was not showing me any of that. She was showing me attention and orientation, and something that I thought, carefully, I would call readiness. I sat down on my mat. "Do you know who's out there?" I said. The head turned toward me briefly, then back to the east wall. "I'll take that as yes," I said. I drank my tea. She stood. The morning light came in through the south windows and lay across her back, and the scales showed their full color. The amber, the deep red, the storm cloud depth of them, and she was very still and very large and very present in the room in a way she had not been when I arrived 6 days ago. After about an hour, I said to Arvith Don, who was standing quietly near the door, "You can let them know they may enter." He looked at me. The monitoring order is for distress assessment and potential euthanasia decision. She is not in distress. She is standing under her own power and eating voluntarily, and is oriented toward incoming contact with no sign of aversion. That is my clinical assessment. Whatever is outside that wall is not a veterinary matter. I picked up my case file. It's a family matter. "Let them in." He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once and went to the door. I heard them before I saw them. Not sound, exactly, or not sound my ears were built for. A frequency below ordinary hearing, something the stone of the walls carried more than the air did. A deep resonance that I felt more in my chest and the backs of my hands than I heard, and that went on for several seconds and then stopped. The east door of the annex opened. There were 3 of them in the doorway. Not 9 ships, but 3 had come to the door, which I thought was either the most senior 3 or the 3 selected to lead, and the scale of them was considerable but not overwhelming in the way Veldorath's scale was overwhelming, because these were not 400-year-old ancients. These were 50 years, I thought, 70, young by comparison. Their scales a brighter green-black, the wings folded with the clean tension of full strength, their eyes a clear and vivid amber gold. They stopped in the doorway and looked at Veldorath. She turned her head toward them. The pale candle wax eyes moved to the doorway, and the great nostrils opened, and she stood there in the morning light. And the 3 in the doorway, the 3 who had come in the 9 ships before dawn and waited outside the wall for permission to enter, lowered their heads. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was the gesture of people in the presence of something they had not expected to see, and the lowering was slow and careful, like a motion done with great awareness of what it meant, and then they were still. Veldorath made a sound. The first sound I had heard from her. It was low, resonant, subvocal, the kind of sound that I felt more in the floor beneath me than heard with my ears, and it was not a word I use for animals, as a rule, but the only word available. It was tender. It was the low, resonant sound of recognition, of knowing and being known. One of the 3 raised her head and looked at me. I was sitting against my wall. My thermos was in my hand. I had my case notes on my mat beside me. I was, as I tended to be in this room, entirely ordinary, a 60-year-old frontier vet in worn working clothes with a bag of instruments and a mat and a lunch I hadn't opened yet. The one who was looking at me was large and clear-eyed, and her gaze had a quality I had encountered in certain animals at the moment of a very precise attention, not threatening, not assessing in the cold sense, but present in a way that made being looked at feel like a complete and considered action. She said something. I didn't know the language, the formal Veldoreth register, the old trade script that Arvith Don had studied for 11 years. And so I sat and let it land over me without trying to parse it. Arvith Don translated very quietly from the door. She says we received a signal 3 days ago, not a transmission through any standard channel, a signal through the line bond, something we have not felt from Veldoreth in 11 years. He paused. She says we didn't know what it meant. We only knew that she had returned, come back to something, and we came. I looked at Veldorath, the great blind ancient, standing in the morning light, her head now moved so that she was facing both the three at the eastern door and me at the western wall simultaneously, as much as that was geometrically possible for a neck of that length, facing both at once. Through the line bond, I said. Arvith Dawn relayed this. The one who had spoken answered. The matriarch bond, he translated. She is the matriarch of the second formations line. The 9 ships outside represent the last of that line in this sector. Descendants, branch line keepers, secondary formation members. When the matriarch bond goes quiet, they feel its absence. When it wakens again, they feel that too. I thought about what it meant. But years of quiet. 3 days ago, she had turned toward the smell of a core fruit paste sandwich. 3 days ago, she had, on some level unavailable to clinical assessment, returned, and they had felt it and come. I sat with that for a moment. The one who had been looking at me spoke again. She spoke at some length this time, looking at me, and then at Veldoreth, and then back, and Arvith Dawn translated slowly, haltingly, as if trying to find the precise equivalents for things that the common tongue had not been built to carry. She says, we have a word for what you are, keth-val. She says it translates approximately as the one who kept the fire company while it did not know it was burning. A pause. She says it is not a common word. It names a thing that is rarely needed and rarely done. She says, there is no obligation required of you by this name. It is only accurate. A true name for what was done here. I looked at Veldoreth. The great head had moved again, in the slow tidal way of her movement, and it was now. I would not have believed this if I were not looking at it. Resting on the floor approximately 1 arm's length from my mat. The pale candle wax eyes, the blinded eyes, were pointed at my face with the same quiet attention they had been pointing at my face on and off for 6 days now. And I thought, looking at them, she knows this room. She knows where I sit. She knows the sound of the thermos cap and the sound of the mat unfolding and the smell of the core fruit, paste and the cadence of my voice talking about the water level in the Velshan Basin and the freight regulations at Corvith. She knows all of those things the way you know, the things that were present when you came back from a very long way away. I thought about that for a moment. About what it meant to be the thing that was present when someone came back from a very long way away. About whether that required any particular quality beyond availability and consistency. I had been available and consistent because Paul Vasson had assigned me to a monitoring window, and I had a mat and a thermos and a bag of core grass. I had not brought any gift the 3 keepers hadn't brought in 11 years of formal addresses and ceremonial offerings. I had simply brought it in a different way. The way you bring something when you are not expecting it to be received, when you are not waiting for the return. Keth-val. The one who kept the fire company while it did not know it was burning. I turned it over in my mind. It was not a word I would have chosen for what I had done. I had sat on a mat for 6 days and eaten sandwiches and talked about the Velshan Basin. But I understood what it was naming. There is a difference between caring for something and being with something. The keepers had cared, the feeding line, the formal greetings, the daily offerings. All of that was care, real and sustained and worthy. What they had not been able to do, not from any failure of will, but from the structure of the thing, was simply be in the room in a way that cost nothing and asked nothing back. The ceremonial address required a recipient. The formal greeting assumed a response, even if the response never came. There was an expectation embedded in all of it, the good expectation of people who care deeply and want to see the caring received. And Veldoreth, wherever she had been for 11 years, had not been available for reception. The core fruit paste sandwich had no expectation. The case notes had no expectation. The sound of my bad ankle on the stone floor had no expectation whatsoever. Tell her, I said to Arvith Dawn, that I'm glad she's eating. Tell her the core grass supplier at the depot will want a standing order if the fleet intends to maintain a presence here. And tell her that if she wants someone from the line to stay with Veldorath going forward, someone who knows the bond language, the formal greetings, the line's way of doing things, then the temple staff would welcome that, and so would Veldoreth, I think. He relayed this. The one who had spoken listened, and then looked at Veldorath, and then looked at me, and something moved in her expression that was not a human expression, but that I read the way you read any face that is grappling with something larger than it expected, something recalibrating. She spoke again. Arvith Dawn translated, she says, you named what was needed with great precision. She asks if you would give them the same 3 days. I frowned. The same 3, she means, would you give them 3 days to learn how you sat with her? Before you go. I looked at Veldorath, the pale eyes, the slow breathing, the enormous scaled body in the morning light. Yes, I said, I can do that. I stayed for 3 more days. I sat against my wall with my thermos and my mat and my notes, and the young ones from the fleet, 2 of them at a time, on a rotation, sat on the other side of the room and watched, and then sat closer, and then by the second day, sat in their own spots and began to talk. Not the formal register, not the ceremonial addresses. They talked the way I talked about ordinary things, about the approach flight, about the basin weather, about the core grass and whether it was available in the western trade routes, about what Veldorath had been like when she was young, which was before any of them had been alive but which the line's memory held and which they told to her in the slow, undemanding way of people catching an elder up on things they already knew but might like to hear again. They learned quickly. I had not expected that, although on reflection it made sense. They had the language, which was the bigger part of it, and what I was teaching them was not a technique but simply a permission. Permission to be present without requiring anything back. Permission to value the company of someone who could not respond in the ways they might have wanted, as company worth having regardless. That is a thing that has to be given, I have found. You cannot talk yourself into it. You have to see it working. See that the animal's tail uncurls. See that the head turns. And believe from observation that the ordinary fact of your presence matters even when you cannot verify that it does. They saw it. By the 7th day, one of the 2 who had been sitting with her began bringing core grass to present the way I had shown them. Flat. Palm, no urgency, available rather than offered. And Veldorath took it from them, and the young one sat for a long time afterward without speaking, looking at their own hand with an expression I did not try to read. Arvith Dawn came and sat with us in the evenings. He brought tea from the temple stores, a different blend from mine, something with dried core blossom in it that was fragrant and slightly sweet, and he poured for all of us, the young fleet members, the 3 temple keepers, the frontier vet, and we sat in the room in the fading afternoon light, and Veldorath moved slowly in the center of the room. And the conversation ranged the way conversation does in rooms where people have stopped being strangers, but are not yet sure what they are to each other, covering the practical and the philosophical and the entirely trivial with equal ease. Veldorath ate. She stood. She moved through the room at intervals, the slow tidal movement of her, and her head turned toward voices and away and back. On the 9th day, I saw her bring her head to rest, briefly, on the floor near the spot where one of the young line members was sitting, and the young one went very still and very careful, and said something very quietly. And I did not have Arvith Dawn to translate, but I thought it was probably something that didn't need translation. He translated it anyway. Later, when we were in the corridor, she said, I see you, eldest. He was quiet for a moment. It's what you say to someone who has been waiting. I thought about that for a while. On my last morning, I packed my kit bag the way I always packed it. Instruments, file, reader, the thermos. And I folded the mat and put it against the wall with the chair that Arvith Dawn had brought on the first day. Both of them unused as seats, but part of the room now, part of its furniture. Veldorath was already awake. She was standing in the center of the room, her head at window height, the morning light full on her back. And she turned toward the sound of my arrival in the doorway with the same precision she had been turning for 9 days. And I said, morning, the way I always said it. Her nostrils moved. I walked to my spot and crouched down and rested my back against the wall one more time. I didn't open the thermos. I had an hour's drive back to the practice and a full day of stock calls starting at 8, and Marette would have tea ready at the house, and I didn't need the thermos. I just sat there for a while. She moved toward me. Slowly, in that tidal way, the neck extending across the floor until the great head was resting about half a meter from my feet, and the pale eyes were pointed at my face, and I looked at them for a long time. I'll be back through when I have calls in the way station circuit, I said. Probably 4 weeks. Might be 3 if the Darosi animals need a follow-up. I looked at the eyes. The core grass order is placed. Arvith has the feeding schedule. Pell's got my contact if anything changes. The breathing was steady. The scales moved. The room was warm and light. You were somewhere a long time, I said. Somewhere I couldn't follow and couldn't ask about, and that's all right. I just didn't want you to be there alone. I stood up. I picked up my kit bag. I said good morning to the 2 young line members who were settling into their spots on the far side of the room And they said good morning back in common, accented but clear, and one of them said, "Safe travels, Keth-Val." I walked to the door. At the door I looked back once. Veldorath's head had turned to follow the sound of my steps, and was pointed at the door. "See you in 4 weeks," I said. I went out through the courtyard into the early morning and loaded my kit into the ground car and drove back along the plateau road toward the practice. The light was clean and white off the plateau, and the dust had not come up yet. And there were 2 core-ridge deer on the embankment near the way station turn, and I slowed down to check the hind leg on the smaller one, and it was moving well. Better than last week, tracking evenly, no compensatory lean. Probably fine. Probably had been fine for some time and I'd been worrying unnecessarily. I pulled back onto the road and drove home.